The first burst caught Petty Officer Ruiz in the throat before anyone could shout a warning. Senior Chief Tobias Achterberg was already diving for cover when the jungle erupted in gunfire from three sides. Muzzle flashes strobing through the undergrowth like angry fireflies in the pre-dawn darkness. He hit the mud behind a fallen dipterocarp tree and immediately started counting his men through the chaos. 6 went into this jungle. He needed to know how many were still breathing. 40 feet to his left, he saw Kendricks dragging the radio man toward cover. The radio man was not moving. The satellite phone was strapped to his chest, and Tobias watched a round punch through the casing in a shower of sparks and plastic. There went their primary communication. There went their extraction. "Return fire," he shouted, suppressing East. "Keep their heads down." His team responded with the precision of men who had trained together for 4 years. But Tobias could hear the difference in their weapons. They were already conserving ammunition, already doing the mathematics of survival that separated veterans from corpses. Before we continue with what happens next, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Maybe you have veterans in your family who have faced impossible situations like this one. 80 feet above the jungle floor, concealed in a platform she had constructed 3 days ago in the branches of a strangler fig, Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Vashchenko watched the ambush unfold through her rifle scope. Her breathing was steady, her heart rate barely elevated. She had seen men die before. She had caused men to die before. But watching without acting carved something out of her chest that she could not name. Her earpiece crackled with her handler's voice, calm and clinical from a secure facility 6,000 miles away. "Phantom, confirm weapons hold. You are observing only. Do not engage." "Weapons hold confirmed," Elena replied, and the words tasted like ash. She had been in position for 72 hours, surviving on water tablets and protein paste, urinating into a collection bag, never moving more than inches at a time. Her mission was simple in description and brutal in execution. Intelligence suggested that someone in the American military infrastructure was leaking operational details to enemy networks in the Philippine archipelago. 3 missions had been compromised in the past 2 months. 12 Americans dead. The Joint Task Force she worked for, an organization so classified that its budget was buried in 17 different line items across 4 agencies, had sent her to observe this SEAL team and document whether the ambush matched the leaked intelligence patterns. If it matched, she would have confirmation that the traitor had access to Naval Special Warfare operational planning. That would narrow the suspect pool from 300 to 30. 30 more deaths, maybe before they found him, but they would find him. That was the calculus she was supposed to accept. Below, the senior chief was reorganizing his team with a competence that Elena recognized as exceptional even among special operators. He had already identified the enemy's primary axis of fire and was collapsing his perimeter to create interlocking fields of defense. 2 of his men were wounded but fighting. One was clearly dead, the radio man's body still and silent where Kendricks had dragged him behind cover. Elena shifted her scope to the enemy positions. She counted at least 30 fighters moving through the undergrowth with the confidence of men who knew exactly where their targets would be. That confidence was the signature she had been sent to identify. No ambush was this precise without inside information. No enemy force positioned themselves this perfectly without knowing the exact route and timeline of their prey. Confirmation, she thought. The intelligence officer on the USS Green Bay, Lieutenant Commander Preston Whitmore, had sold these men's lives for whatever price traders accepted these days. A fighter broke from cover and sprinted toward the SEAL position, AK-47 raised. Elena's crosshairs tracked him automatically, her finger resting on the trigger with the gentle pressure of 15 years of muscle memory. 1 squeeze, 2 pounds of force. The man would drop, and the SEALs would have 1 less threat. Her handler's voice returned. "Phantom, I'm showing elevated biometrics. Confirm weapons hold." She watched the fighter close the distance. Watched Senior Chief Achterberg spot him and swing his weapon around. Watched the SEALs burst catch the man's center mass and drop him 3 feet from the perimeter. Weapons hold confirmed, Elena said again. But as she swept her scope across the battlefield, she saw what the SEALs could not. A team of 4 fighters working through a drainage ditch to the north, completely invisible from ground level. In approximately 90 seconds, they would have a clean angle on the entire American position. The SEALs would never see them coming. Elena had a choice to make. Follow orders and watch 5 Americans die to preserve intelligence that might save dozens later. Or break cover, reveal her existence, compromise her mission, and save the men bleeding in the mud below her. 72 hours ago, when she had climbed into this tree with nothing but her rifle and her duty, the choice would have been simple. The mission came first. It always came first. But 3 days of watching these men had changed something she had not expected to change. She had watched Senior Chief Achterberg share his water ration with a junior operator who was struggling in the heat. She had watched him spend 20 minutes helping Ruiz compose a letter to his pregnant wife back home. She had watched him pray quietly every morning before dawn, his lips moving in words she could not hear but somehow understood. These were not assets on a mission board. These were fathers and sons and brothers, and they were about to die because a man she had never met had sold them out for money. The fighters in the drainage ditch were 60 seconds from position. Elena watched them move with the detached precision of her training, calculating angles and distances and probabilities. Her handler's voice cut through her concentration. "Phantom, I need verbal confirmation of weapons hold." "Acknowledge." Elena Vashchenko, the woman who had spent 8 months in complete isolation for this mission, who had not had a genuine human conversation since the previous spring, who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by another person, moved her finger from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. 50 seconds. She thought about the cross her grandmother had given her before she died, lost somewhere in a storage unit in Virginia. She thought about the last time she had laughed, really laughed, and could not remember. She thought about what it meant to follow orders that killed good men to catch bad ones. 40 seconds. The drainage ditch fighters were almost in position. Through her scope, Elena could see the senior chief, completely unaware, his attention fixed on the threat to his east while death crept toward him from the north. Her earpiece crackled one final time. "Phantom, acknowledge weapons hold immediately." Elena removed the earpiece and let it fall into the jungle canopy below. The mission parameters had just changed. She was no longer here to observe. The fighters reached their position and began to raise their weapons toward the unsuspecting SEALs. Elena exhaled half a breath, felt the familiar calm settle over her like a second skin, and placed her crosshairs on the lead fighter's chest. The first round left her barrel at 2,700 feet per second, crossing the 80 feet of vertical distance and 40 feet of horizontal separation in the time it took Elena to blink. The lead fighter in the drainage ditch crumpled without a sound, his weapon clattering against the rocks as his body folded in on itself. Before his companions could process what had happened, Elena had already shifted her aim and squeezed the trigger twice more. 3 men down in less than 2 seconds. The 4th fighter panicked and broke from cover, sprinting back the way he had come. Elena let him go. He was no longer a threat, and she needed to conserve ammunition for the enemies who still were. Below, Senior Chief Achterberg had frozen mid-motion, his head swiveling toward the drainage ditch where 3 bodies now lay in positions the human spine was never meant to achieve. He had not heard the shots. Her suppressor was military grade, reducing the report to something barely louder than a book dropping on carpet. But he had seen the men fall, and he knew with the certainty of 20 years in special operations that someone had just saved his life from a direction he had never thought to check. His voice carried up to her position, sharp with command despite his confusion. "Who has eyes on that shooter? Anyone see where that came from?" "Negative, Senior Chief." Kendricks was wrapping a tourniquet around his own thigh while still maintaining his sector of fire. "Came from above us somewhere. Way above." Achterberg's gaze swept the canopy, and for a moment Elena felt his eyes pass directly over her position. Her ghillie suit was woven with local vegetation she had harvested during her 3 days of observation. Even knowing exactly where to look, he would see nothing but jungle. She watched him process the tactical implications. An unknown shooter with extreme precision, engaging from an elevated position, using suppressed weapons. That profile matched exactly one type of operator, and it was not a profile that should exist in this jungle without his knowledge. Guardian Angel or setup, he muttered, just loud enough for Elena to catch. Either way, we work with what we have. Kendricks, shift your fire to cover north. Whoever is up there just showed us our blind spot. The battle continued for another 20 minutes, and Elena made herself useful in ways the SEALs could not see but definitely felt. Every time a fighter maneuvered into a dangerous position, he died before he could exploit it. Every time the enemy tried to concentrate forces for a rush, the point man dropped and the others scattered. She was burning through ammunition faster than she had planned, but the alternative was watching Americans die, and she had already made her choice about that. 6,000 miles away, her handler was probably losing his mind. Breaking weapons hold was a career-ending offense. Breaking weapons hold and removing your communication equipment was something else entirely. Elena did not know what they would do to her when this was over, and in this moment, with her rifle barking death into the jungle below, she found that she did not care. On the USS Green Bay, Lieutenant Commander Preston Whitmore stood in the Combat Information Center and watched the drone feed with growing horror. The SEAL team was supposed to be dead by now. The ambush had been perfectly positioned, the intelligence precise, the outcome all but guaranteed. Instead, he was watching enemy fighters drop one by one from shots that seemed to come from nowhere. Someone was out there. Someone who was not part of the mission profile. Someone who was systematically dismantling the ambush he had arranged. Whitmore felt sweat prickle along his spine despite the aggressive air conditioning. His contact had paid him $40,000 for this operation, the latest in a series of transactions that had started small and grown into something he could no longer control. The gambling debts had been the beginning. The first leak had been minor, a patrol schedule that seemed harmless. But each transaction had led to another, and now he was standing in an American military facility watching Americans fight for their lives because of information he had sold. If those SEALs survived, there would be an investigation. The intelligence had been too specific, the ambush too perfectly positioned. Someone would ask questions. Someone would start looking at who had access to the operational details. Someone would eventually look at him. He needed those SEALs to die, and whoever was helping them needed to die too. Whitmore pulled out his personal phone, the one he used for communications that could never touch official channels, and typed a message to his contact. Unknown shooter assisting targets. Provide additional forces. Ensure no survivors. He sent the message and deleted it immediately, then returned his attention to the drone feed with the expression of a concerned officer, hoping for the best. No one in the Combat Information Center noticed anything unusual. No one ever did. In the jungle, Elena finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. The enemy had pulled back to regroup, giving the SEALs a temporary reprieve. She took stock of her situation. 17 rounds remaining in her primary magazine, 2 spare magazines of 20 rounds each. Her water was down a half a liter. Her position was still secure, but the muzzle flashes from her rifle, however suppressed, would eventually give her away if the enemy was smart enough to triangulate. She needed to move. Standard sniper doctrine demanded relocating after engagement to prevent counter-sniper operations. But moving meant leaving the SEALs without cover, and she could see through her scope that 2 of them were badly wounded. If the enemy rushed now, in force, the Americans would not survive. Elena made another choice, the kind of choice that separated operators who followed doctrine from operators who followed conscience. She stayed in position. Below, Achterberg was working on one of his wounded men, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Elena watched him whisper something to the injured SEAL, something that made the man nod despite the pain etched across his face. A promise, probably. A lie, possibly. The kind of thing leaders said to keep their people fighting when the mathematics said fighting was pointless. Her scope drifted to the dead radio man, still lying where he had fallen in the first seconds of the ambush. Dog tags glinted against his chest. Someone back home was going to get a knock on their door. Someone was going to have their world destroyed by 3 words. We regret to inform. Elena had delivered those words herself, once in a previous life. She remembered the widow's face. She remembered the children who did not understand why their father was never coming home. She remembered the weight of the folded flag in her hands as she passed it over with words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Not today, she promised the dead man silently. Not your brothers. Not if I can help it. The jungle had grown quiet, that particular silence that preceded violence. Elena scanned the treeline and saw what she had been dreading. The enemy was regrouping in larger numbers. She counted at least 40 fighters massing to the east, with more arriving every minute. Someone had called for reinforcements. Worse, she saw a man moving through the enemy ranks with the bearing of command. Older than the others, calmer, directing the chaos with hand signals and quiet words. A leader, the kind of leader who would not make the mistakes his men had been making. Through her scope, Elena watched him study the jungle canopy with eyes that understood exactly what he was looking for. He knew there was a sniper up there somewhere, and unlike his men, he was going to be smart about finding her. She shifted her crosshairs to his chest and considered taking the shot. Kill the leader and the followers would falter. It was basic insurgent warfare doctrine. But even as her finger found the trigger, she saw him turn and speak to a younger fighter at his side. The younger man nodded and touched the older man's shoulder with obvious affection. A brother, perhaps, or a son. Elena hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, the older man looked directly at her position. He could not see her. She was certain of that. But somehow, impossibly, he knew she was there. Commander Reginald Santos had not survived 20 years of jungle warfare by ignoring his instincts. The Americans were pinned exactly where his intelligence had promised they would be, dying exactly as he had planned, and yet something was wrong. His men were falling to shots that made no sound from angles that made no sense. Someone was up there in the canopy, someone with skills that matched or exceeded his own fighters, and that someone had just changed the mathematics of this engagement. He turned to his younger brother, Teodoro, and spoke in the Tausig dialect of their childhood. There's a snake in the trees. Find it for me. Teodoro nodded and began organizing a search team. He was 26 years old, sharp and eager. Everything Reginald had once been before the Americans had taken his family and left him with nothing but rage and purpose. Their mother had died in the same drone strike that killed Reginald's wife and daughters. Their father had died of grief 6 months later. Now there were only 2 Santos brothers left, bound by blood and vengeance, and the absolute certainty that the Americans would pay for what they had done. Reginald returned his attention to the trapped seals. He could overwhelm them with a massed assault, accept the casualties, and end this within minutes. But that would mean losing more of his men to the invisible shooter, and his men were not expendable resources. There were fathers and sons and brothers too, fighting for their homes against an empire that dropped bombs on villages and called it counterterrorism. No, he would be patient. He would find the sniper first, eliminate the threat from above, and then finish the Americans at his leisure. 80 feet above the jungle floor, Elena watched the enemy commander direct his forces with growing unease. This was not the disorganized insurgent leadership she had encountered in Afghanistan or Syria. This man understood tactics. He understood patience. And he understood that rushing the American position while she held the high ground would be suicide. He was going to hunt her. She scanned the enemy lines and saw a team of 6 fighters breaking off from the main force, moving not toward the seals, but toward the base of the massive strangler fig that held her platform. They were not looking up. Not yet. But they were spreading out in a search pattern that would eventually bring them directly beneath her position. Elena did the calculations. 6 targets, 17 rounds in her current magazine. She could eliminate them all before they located her, but the sustained fire would give away her exact position to everyone else. The moment she engaged, every fighter in the jungle would know exactly which tree to focus on. She needed to move. But moving meant abandoning the seals during what might be the most critical phase of their survival. Her scope swept back to the American position. Senior Chief Achterberg had consolidated his team into a tight defensive perimeter, but the situation was deteriorating. One of his men was unconscious. Another was applying pressure to a wound that was bleeding faster than the bandages could contain. They had maybe 2 hours of ammunition at current consumption rates. Less if the enemy rushed them. 2 hours. Elena could work with 2 hours. She began preparing for movement, collapsing her shooting platform into a configuration she could carry, securing her equipment against noise. Every motion was deliberate, practiced, silent. She had trained for jungle operations in Panama, in Colombia, in the Philippines itself during a previous deployment that officially never happened. She knew how to move through canopy without disturbing a single leaf. The search team was getting closer. She could hear them now, speaking in low voices, their Tausig dialect carrying through the humid air. They were arguing about where to look, whether the sniper was even real or just luck favoring the Americans. One of them wanted to return to the main assault. Another insisted they follow orders. Elena finished her preparations and began her descent. Moving through strangler fig roots was like navigating a vertical maze, each step requiring absolute precision to avoid the deadfall that would send her plummeting to the jungle floor. She moved inches at a time, her rifle slung across her back, her hands finding purchase on vines and branches that had supported her weight for 3 days. Below, the search team had reached the base of her tree. She froze, pressing herself into a hollow between 2 massive roots, and watched through a gap as they examined the ground for signs of passage. One of them pointed upward, squinting into the canopy, and Elena felt her heart rate spike despite years of training designed to prevent exactly that response. She was 15 feet above them, close enough to smell the cigarette smoke on their clothes, close enough to hear one of them complain about missing breakfast for this mission, close enough to kill all 6 before any of them could raise a weapon. But killing them would bring the others, and then she would be trapped in a firefight with nowhere to run. The fighter who had pointed upward said something dismissive and turned away. The search team moved on, continuing their sweep toward a cluster of dipterocarp trees 50 meters to the east. Elena allowed herself to breathe. She resumed her descent, reaching the jungle floor for the first time in 3 days. The ground felt strange beneath her boots, too solid, too permanent after the swaying uncertainty of the canopy. She took a moment to orient herself, identifying landmarks, planning her route to a secondary position she had scouted during her initial insertion. A burst of gunfire erupted from the direction of the SEAL perimeter. Elena dropped into a crouch, her rifle coming up automatically, but the shots were not directed at her. The enemy was probing the American defenses, testing for weaknesses, keeping pressure on the trap team while the search continued. She needed to move faster. The secondary position was 200 meters north, another strangler fig with good sight lines to the SEAL perimeter. Getting there meant crossing open ground, risking detection, trusting that the enemy was focused on the Americans and not on the jungle behind them. Elena started moving. She used every technique she had ever learned, every skill that 14 years of special operations had burned in her nervous system. She moved when the wind moved. She froze when birds startled. She placed each footstep on ground she had visually cleared for debris that might crack or shift beneath her weight. 100 meters. She was halfway there when she heard voices ahead. Elena melted into the undergrowth, becoming part of the jungle floor, her ghillie suit breaking up her silhouette until she was nothing but shadow and vegetation. 2 fighters walked past her position, close enough that she could have reached out and touched their boots. They were talking about the battle, about how long the Americans could hold out, about what they would do when it was over. One of them mentioned a name, Whitmore, the American who had given them the information. Elena filed that confirmation away and remained motionless until the fighters had passed. Then she continued her movement, slower now, more cautious. The enemy was everywhere. The jungle that had been her sanctuary for 3 days had become a maze filled with men who wanted her dead. She reached the secondary position and began her climb, muscles screaming from the abuse of the past hour. The new strangler fig was smaller than the first, with less cover, but it offered clear sight lines to both the SEAL perimeter and the enemy staging area. She could see Commander Santos conferring with his lieutenants, pointing at a map, making decisions that would determine whether 5 Americans lived or died. Elena settled into her new position and raised her rifle. The SEALs were still holding, still fighting, still believing that help would come. She had bought them time with her first engagement. Now, she needed to buy them more. Her crosshairs found a fighter who was maneuvering toward a flanking position the SEALs had not identified. She exhaled, felt the familiar calm, and squeezed the trigger. The fighter dropped, and somewhere in the enemy lines, Commander Santos lifted his head and smiled. He had been watching the jungle. He had seen the muzzle flash. Now he knew exactly where she was. The monsoon announced itself with a sound like tearing fabric, and then the sky collapsed. Rain hammered the canopy with such force that Elena could barely see 30 feet in any direction. The jungle transformed into a vertical river, water cascading down through the layers of vegetation, turning the forest floor into a maze of instant streams and treacherous mud. Under any other circumstances, Elena would have welcomed the storm. Rain-masked movement covered sound, turned the jungle into an ally for anyone trying to disappear. But she was not trying to disappear. She was trying to protect 5 Americans who were now completely invisible to her through the sheets of falling water. She could hear gunfire below, muffled by the rain, but unmistakable. The enemy was using the storm cover to press their attack. Smart tactics from a smart commander. Santos understood that the rain blinded the sniper more than it blinded his ground forces, and he was exploiting that advantage with brutal efficiency. Elena made a decision that went against every instinct her training had developed. She began descending from her position, moving toward the sound of battle rather than away from it. If she could not provide overwatch from above, she would find another way to help. The climb down was treacherous. Rain had turned the strangler fig's bark into something slicker than ice, and every handhold threatened to send her tumbling to the ground. She moved by feel more than sight, trusting her body to find purchase where her eyes could not guide her. Twice she slipped, catching herself on vines that cut into her palms like wire. By the time she reached the jungle floor, her hands were bleeding and her heart was pounding with something that felt dangerously close to fear. The battle sounds grew louder as she moved toward the SEAL perimeter. She could distinguish individual weapons now. The sharp crack of American rifles answered by the deeper chatter of AK-47s. Someone was screaming, the sound cutting through the rain with an urgency that made Elena move faster than caution allowed. She nearly walked into the firefight. A cluster of enemy fighters had pushed to within 20 meters of the American position, using the rain as cover for their advance. Elena dropped behind a fallen log and assessed the situation in the span of 2 heartbeats. 5 fighters spread in a loose formation, focused entirely on the SEALs ahead of them. They had no idea she was behind them. Elena raised her rifle and began firing. The suppressor reduced her shots to sounds that vanished in the rain. The first fighter fell without his companions noticing. The second dropped a moment later, and by then the others were starting to realize something was wrong. The third turned toward her position just in time to take a round through his chest. The fourth and fifth tried to run, and Elena put them down before they had covered 10 feet. 5 targets, 5 kills, less than 4 seconds. The kind of shooting that would have earned applause on any range in the world. Here, in the rain-soaked jungle with blood mixing into the mud, it felt like nothing at all. She moved forward, stepping over bodies, and found herself at the edge of the SEAL perimeter. A weapon swung toward her immediately, and she heard Senior Chief Achterberg's voice cutting through the storm. "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Friendly approaching. Elena emerged from the undergrowth with her hands visible, her rifle slung across her chest. The SEALs stared at her like she was a ghost, which in some way she supposed she was. A woman in a ghillie suit, appearing from nowhere, covered in mud and blood and rain. "Who the hell are you?" Achterberg demanded. "Friendly," Elena replied. "The rest can wait until we are not being shot at." The senior chief studied her for a long moment, calculating risks and benefits with the speed of a man who had made life-or-death decisions more times than he could count. Then he nodded once and turned back to his defensive position. "Welcome to the party. We're almost out of ammunition, and I have 2 men who need a hospital. Please tell me you have a radio." Elena shook her head. "Lost it during movement." "What is your communication status?" "Dead," Achterberg said. "Primary and backup both destroyed in the initial contact. We have been dark for 3 hours. 3 hours without communication meant no one was coming. The rescue mission that should have launched by now was sitting idle because no one knew the SEALs needed rescuing." Elena felt the weight of that realization settle onto her shoulders alongside everything else she was carrying. She moved to the center of the perimeter and took stock of the situation. 2 SEALs were still combat effective, including Achterberg. One was wounded but functional, his left arm bound tight against his chest. One was unconscious, breathing but unresponsive, a bandage wrapped around his head dark with blood. The 5th man, the radio man, was dead and covered with a poncho that did nothing to hide the shape beneath it. The rain showed no signs of letting up. Through the downpour, Elena could see movement in the jungle. The enemy was regrouping, preparing for another push. Santos would not wait forever. She turned to Achterberg. "How many magazines do you have left?" The senior chief's expression told her the answer before his words did. "Maybe 60 rounds combined. We have been conserving, but there is only so much you can do when they keep coming. 60 rounds against 40 or more fighters." The mathematics were impossible. Even with her own remaining ammunition added to the count, they were looking at less than 100 rounds to hold off an enemy force that outnumbered them 8-1. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rain wash over her face, and thought about the choices that had brought her to this place. She had disobeyed orders. She had revealed her existence. She had compromised a mission that might have saved dozens of future lives. And none of it mattered now, because she was going to die in this jungle alongside the men she had tried to save. Then she opened her eyes and saw Petty Officer Kendricks staring at her with an expression she did not immediately recognize. It took her a moment to realize it was Hope. This man, bleeding and exhausted and facing certain death, was looking at her like she was the answer to a prayer he had not known he was praying. She thought about her father, the Soviet veteran who had defected because he could not follow orders that killed innocents. She thought about why she had joined this life in the first place, the oath she had taken, the promise she had made to protect Americans no matter the cost. Elena reached into her pack and pulled out the one piece of equipment she had not yet mentioned. An emergency beacon, single use, capable of punching through any jamming with a burst transmission that would reach any American military asset within 500 miles. The catch was simple. Using it would reveal her exact position to the enemy as clearly as it revealed it to friendly forces. It was a last resort, designed for situations where death was certain and the only question was whether anyone would ever find the body. She held it up so Achterberg could see. "I can call for help. But the moment I activate this, every fighter in the jungle will know exactly where we are." The senior chief looked at the beacon, then at his wounded men, then at the jungle where death was gathering for another assault. "Do it," he said. Elena pressed the button. The beacon's signal lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of electromagnetic noise screaming their position to every receiver within range, friendly and hostile alike. Elena watched the tiny light on the device fade from green to black and felt the weight of what she had just done settle into her bones. Somewhere out there, American forces were scrambling. Somewhere out there, rescue birds were spinning up their rotors and pilots were plotting coordinates. But somewhere much closer, Commander Santos was receiving the same information, and he would not need hours to respond. They had maybe 15 minutes before the enemy consolidated and launched their final assault. 15 minutes to prepare for a fight they could not win. Senior Chief Achterberg was already moving, repositioning his men into tighter defensive positions, redistributing the pitiful ammunition reserves to maximize their effectiveness. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had accepted his death and decided to make it expensive. Elena had seen that look before, on faces in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a dozen other places where Americans had fought and bled and died. It was the look of someone who had stopped hoping and started planning. She could not afford that luxury. Hope was the only thing keeping her functional. Elena took position at the northern edge of the perimeter, the direction she judged most likely for the enemy's main assault. The rain had slackened to a steady drizzle, improving visibility but also making them easier targets. She counted her remaining rounds. 34 in her rifle, another 40 in her sidearm. Enough to make a difference. Not enough to make a miracle. Kendricks crawled up beside her, his wounded arm tucked against his chest, his good hand gripping his rifle with white-knuckled determination. He was pale from blood loss, and his breathing was shallow, but his eyes were clear. "I never got your name," he said. Elena considered the question. Her real name was classified. Her operational call sign was known only to a handful of people in the intelligence community. But classification seemed absurd now, in this jungle, with death approaching through the trees. "Elena," she said. "My name is Elena." Kendricks nodded, as if this information was the most important thing he had learned all day. "I am David. I have a daughter. She's turning 4 next week." Elena felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had built to keep herself functional in situations exactly like this one. She did not want to know about his daughter. She did not want to imagine a little girl waiting for a father who might never come home. But she could not stop herself from asking, "What is her name?" "Sophia. She wants to be a mermaid when she grows up." Kendricks laughed, a broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. "I promised her I would be home for her party. I promised her." "You will be," Elena said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Not as false comfort, not as the kind of lie leaders told to keep their people fighting. She meant it as a vow, a commitment, a promise she would keep or die trying. "You will be home for her party, David. I'm going to make sure of it." The jungle exploded before Kendricks could respond. Enemy fighters poured from the tree-line in a coordinated assault that hit their perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously. Elena's rifle came up automatically, her training taking over, her conscious mind retreating to somewhere quiet while her body did what it had been built to do. She fired and shifted and fired again, each shot finding its target, each trigger pull buying another second of survival. Beside her, Kendricks was shooting one-handed, his wounded arm forgotten in the adrenaline flood of combat. Achterberg's voice rose above the chaos, calling targets, directing fire, keeping his team functioning as a unit even as the world dissolved into noise and violence. The first wave broke against their position like water against stone. Bodies piled at the edge of the perimeter, fighters who had charged expecting easy kills and found something else entirely. Elena counted 11 dead in the first 30 seconds, but more were coming. Always more. "Reloading," she shouted, dropping her empty magazine and slamming a fresh one home. Her hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory forged through 10,000 repetitions on ranges from Virginia to California to places that did not appear on any map. The second wave hit before the first had fully retreated. These fighters were smarter, using cover, advancing in bounds, laying down suppressive fire that forced the defenders to keep their heads down. Elena felt a round pass close enough to tug at her ghillie suit, and another ricocheted off the log she was using for cover with a sound like a hammer striking wood. She was going to die here. The certainty of it settled over her like a blanket, not frightening, but almost peaceful. She had done everything she could. She had broken orders and revealed herself, and fought with everything she had. If this was where her story ended, at least it would end alongside people who had been worth saving. Then she heard Achterberg curse with a vehemence that cut through even the gunfire. "I am out," the senior chief shouted. "Someone give me a magazine." No one answered, because no one had anything left to give. Elena looked at her own rifle. 11 rounds remaining. Kendricks was down to his sidearm. The other functional SEAL was desperately searching bodies for dropped weapons. They had reached the end of their ammunition, and the enemy was still coming. Commander Santos chose that moment to show himself. He emerged from the jungle like a specter, walking calmly through the chaos while his men provided covering fire. His eyes found Elena across the battlefield, and she saw recognition in them. He knew who she was. Not her name, not her unit, but what she represented. She was the one who had killed his men. She was the one who had ruined his ambush. She was the one who had cost him his brother, though she did not know that yet. He raised his rifle and aimed directly at her position. Elena had 11 rounds. She could kill him, probably, before he killed her. But his death would not stop the assault. His men would keep coming, driven by momentum and rage, and they would overrun this position within minutes. She aimed at his chest anyway. If she was going to die, she would take him with her. The shot that rang out did not come from her rifle. Santos stumbled, a red bloom appearing on his shoulder, and his shot went wide. He dropped behind cover, shouting orders in Tausig, and suddenly the assault wavered. Someone had shot their commander. Someone other than the defenders. Elena spun toward the source of the shot and saw something that made no tactical sense. A figure was moving through the enemy's rear lines, firing with precise efficiency, creating chaos where there had been coordination. The enemy fighters were turning, confused, caught between the American position ahead and this new threat behind. The rescue team had arrived, not by helicopter, not in force, but as a small element that had fast roped somewhere to the north and worked their way through the jungle to flank the enemy assault. Elena felt something she had not felt in 8 months, something she had forgotten existed. Hope. The flanking element was small, only 4 operators, but they moved through the enemy's rear with the devastating efficiency of men who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of chaos. Elena watched them work, recognizing the tactics, the precision, the absolute lethality of Tier 1 special operations. These were not regular rescue forces. These were operators from a unit that matched or exceeded her own. The enemy assault collapsed into confusion. Fighters who had been advancing on the SEAL perimeter now found themselves caught in a crossfire, dying before they could identify where the new threat was coming from. Commander Santos was screaming orders, trying to reorganize his men, but the momentum had shifted too quickly. His carefully planned massacre had become a desperate fight for survival. Elena used the distraction to redistribute what little ammunition remained. She gave her last rifle magazine to Achterberg and drew her sidearm, counting the rounds by feel. 17 shots. 17 chances to keep David Kendricks alive long enough to see his daughter's birthday. The flanking element linked up with their position 6 minutes later. The leader was a master sergeant with eyes that had seen too much and a calm that came from absolute confidence in his abilities. He took in the situation with a single glance, cataloging wounded and dead and defensive positions, and then his gaze settled on Elena with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You are Phantom," he said. It was not a question. Elena nodded. The fact that he knew her call sign meant her cover was completely blown. Somewhere in the chain of command, someone had decided that saving these SEALs was worth burning an asset that had taken 2 years to develop. "Extraction is 20 minutes out," the master sergeant continued. "Cobras and a pair of Ospreys. But we have a problem." The problem, as he explained it, was that the enemy had received reinforcements of their own. Another 40 fighters had arrived from a nearby camp, and they were establishing blocking positions along the extraction route. The helicopters could fight their way through, but it would be costly. Marines would die. Pilots would die. The extraction that should have been straightforward had become a potential bloodbath. Elena absorbed this information and felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling onto her shoulders. 20 minutes was an eternity in combat. 20 minutes against 80 fighters with minimal ammunition and multiple wounded. The mathematics had not improved. "There is another option," she said. The master sergeant raised an eyebrow. "The blocking positions are keyed to the extraction route," Elena continued. "If we move the extraction point, they will be out of position. There is a ridgeline half a click north with enough clearance for an Osprey. If we can get there, we can extract before they can reposition. Half a click through hostile jungle with wounded men," the master sergeant said. "That is your other option. It is better than sitting here waiting to be overrun. Achterberg had been listening. He looked at his wounded men, at the bodies of the enemy fighters piled around their perimeter, at the jungle that had nearly become their grave. Then he looked at Elena. "She got us this far," he said to the master sergeant. "I trust her." The master sergeant considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of command decision. "We move in 2 minutes. Consolidate wounded. Leave the dead." He paused, and something flickered across his face that might have been respect. "Phantom, you have point." They moved out in a formation that balanced speed against security, the able-bodied operators forming a protective shell around the wounded. Elena led them through the jungle, following game trails and drainage lines that she had memorized during her 3 days of observation. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed, every shadow examined for threats. The enemy was hunting them. She could feel it, that primal awareness that came from years of operating in hostile territory. Santos had survived his wound, and he would not let them escape. Not after everything they had cost him. She thought about the younger fighter she had seen beside Santos, the one who had touched his shoulder with obvious affection. Brother or son, she had wondered at the time. Now she knew the answer. The search team that had nearly found her in the Strangler Fig had been led by that young man, and she had watched him fall during the initial assault, cut down by fire from the flanking element. Santos had lost his brother today. Elena understood loss. She understood what it did to people, how it transformed grief into rage and rage into purpose. Santos would not stop until they were dead or he was. There was no other outcome that his pain would allow. The ridgeline appeared through the trees, a rocky outcropping that rose above the canopy like a stone fist thrust toward the sky. The clearing at its base was just large enough for an osprey, exactly as Elena had remembered. They were going to make it. Then the jungle erupted with gunfire. Santos had anticipated their move. His fighters had circled ahead, setting up an ambush along the only approach to the ridgeline. Rounds tore through the vegetation, and Elena heard someone behind her cry out in pain. "Cover!" Achterberg shouted, and the formation dissolved into the undergrowth. Elena found herself behind a fallen tree, her sidearm in her hand, her mind racing through options that all ended in death. They were pinned again, caught between the ambush ahead and the pursuit behind. The extraction point was 200 meters away. It might as well have been 200 miles. She looked at the ridgeline and made a decision. "Cover me," she said to the master sergeant. Before he could respond, she was moving. Elena ran through the jungle like something feral, her body low, her movements erratic, presenting the worst possible target while closing the distance to the enemy position. Round snapped past her head, tore through leaves inches from her body, kicked up dirt at her feet. She did not slow down. She did not take cover. She simply ran, trusting speed and luck and the covering fire from her team to keep her alive. She hit the enemy line like a thunderbolt. Her sidearm barked once, twice, 3 times, and fighters fell before they could adjust to her presence among them. She was inside their perimeter now, too close for them to engage without risking each other, and she exploited that confusion with brutal efficiency. A knife appeared in her hand, and then there was no more thought, only action, only the desperate mathematics of survival measured in heartbeats and trigger pulls. When it was over, she stood in the center of the ambush position, surrounded by bodies, her chest heaving, her hands slick with blood that was not entirely her own. The path to the ridgeline was clear. She turned back toward her team and saw them emerging from cover, staring at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching awe. The master sergeant was shaking his head slowly, as if he had just witnessed something that contradicted everything he thought he knew about human capability. "Extraction point secure," Elena said, and her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "Move." They moved, and behind them, watching from the shadows with blood streaming from his shoulder and murder burning in his eyes, Commander Santos began to follow. The ridgeline clearing was smaller than Elena remembered, barely 60 feet across, hemmed in by jungle on 3 sides and a sheer rock face on the 4th. It would be a tight landing for an osprey, the kind of approach that separated exceptional pilots from adequate ones. She hoped whoever was flying the extraction bird fell into the first category. The master sergeant was on the radio, coordinating with the inbound aircraft, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos of the past hour. 10 minutes out, he reported. They are pushing hard. Cobras will suppress any anti-air threats on approach. 10 minutes. Elena scanned the tree line, searching for movement, searching for the pursuit she knew was coming. Santos was out there. She could feel him like a weight pressing against her awareness, a predator circling just beyond sight. He had lost too much today to let them escape. His brother, his men, his carefully planned revenge against the Americans who had taken everything from him. She understood him, she realized. Not his methods, not his targets, but the grief that drove him. She had felt that same grief when her father died, when a man who had taught her everything about honor and sacrifice had slipped away in a hospital bed with her hand in his. Grief could become a compass, pointing toward purpose when everything else fell apart. For Santos, that purpose was vengeance. For Elena, it had been service. Two different paths from the same pain. Kendricks appeared at her side, his face pale, but his eyes alert. He had refused to be carried, insisting on walking under his own power despite the blood loss that made each step a victory of will over weakness. His rifle was empty, discarded somewhere in the jungle, but he had picked up an AK-47 from one of the fallen enemy fighters and held it like he knew how to use it. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you did back there, for what you have done all day." Elena did not know how to respond. Gratitude was not something she encountered often in her line of work. The people she saved rarely knew she existed. The missions she completed were classified so deeply that even success felt like silence. "You would have done the same," she finally said. Kendricks shook his head. "No, I would have tried. But what you did, how you moved through them." He trailed off, searching for words. "I have never seen anything like it. I have been in the teams for 6 years, and I have never seen anyone fight like that." Elena thought about the bodies she had left behind, the faces she had not looked at, the lives she had ended without hesitation. It was easy to be impressive when you stopped being human. When you turned yourself into a weapon, the human cost became abstract, numbers on a ledger rather than souls extinguished. She did not feel impressive. She felt tired. The jungle erupted before she could respond. Gunfire raked the clearing from multiple directions, and Elena was moving before conscious thought could catch up. She tackled Kendricks behind a boulder, covering his body with her own as rounds sparked off the stone inches from their heads. The master sergeant was shouting commands, his team returning fire into the tree line, but they were exposed in the clearing with minimal cover. Santos had caught up. Elena rolled off Kendricks and brought her sidearm up, scanning for targets. The enemy was smart, staying in the jungle, using the vegetation for concealment while pouring fire into the clearing. She counted muzzle flashes. 20, maybe 25 fighters. Santos had consolidated his remaining forces for one final assault. 5 minutes, the master sergeant called out. 5 minutes to extraction. 5 minutes was forever in a firefight. 5 minutes was enough time to die a dozen different ways. Elena saw one of the flanking element operators go down, clutching his leg, still trying to return fire from the ground. She sprinted to his position, grabbed him by his vest, and dragged him behind a rock formation while rounds tore up the ground around them. The operator was cursing steadily, a creative stream of profanity that suggested he was more angry than injured. "Flesh wound," he gasped. "I can still shoot." "Then shoot," Elena said, and turned back to the fight. The next 4 minutes were the longest of her life. She moved through the clearing like a ghost, never staying in one position long enough to draw accurate fire, engaging targets with her dwindling ammunition, keeping the enemy from advancing into the open ground. The master sergeant coordinated the defense with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra of violence. Achterberg anchored the left flank, his borrowed rifle barking steadily. Even the wounded were fighting, propped against rocks, contributing what they could to the desperate effort. 3 minutes. Elena's sidearm clicked empty. She dropped it and drew her knife, the only weapon she had left. Around her, she could hear the others running dry as well. The ammunition they had scavenged was gone. The extraction was still 3 minutes away. She looked at Kendricks and thought about Sophia, the little girl who wanted to be a mermaid. She thought about the promise she had made. She thought about what it would mean to break that promise, to let this man die within sight of rescue. 2 minutes. The enemy sensed their weakness. The fire slackened as fighters prepared for a final rush, gathering themselves to overwhelm the depleted defenders through sheer numbers. Elena could see them massing at the treeline, shadows coalescing into shapes preparing to become death. She gripped her knife and prepared to meet them. Then she heard it, a sound that started as a whisper and grew into a roar. Rotors, multiple aircraft, coming in fast and low from the east. The Cobras arrived first, their miniguns screaming to life as they swept the treeline with fire that turned the jungle into a storm of shattered wood and torn vegetation. The enemy assault disintegrated under the onslaught, fighters scattering into the jungle or falling where they stood. Behind the gunships came the Ospreys, their massive rotors beating the air into submission as they descended toward the clearing. Elena watched them approach and felt something release in her chest, some tension she had been holding for so long she had forgotten it existed. The first Osprey touched down, its ramp already lowering, crew chiefs waving them aboard with urgent gestures. The wounded went first, carried by their teammates, loaded with the efficient care of men who understood that every second on the ground was a second of vulnerability. Elena covered the boarding, her empty hands useless but her eyes still searching the jungle for threats. The Cobras continued their suppression, their fire pushing deeper into the treeline, buying time for the extraction. Kendricks was the last of the wounded to board. He paused at the ramp and looked back at her, his eyes carrying a message that words could not convey. Then he was inside, and the ramp was closing, and the Osprey was lifting off in a hurricane of downdraft. The second bird was waiting. Elena ran toward it, the master sergeant beside her, the last of the ground element boarding as the Cobras made one final pass over the jungle. She was 3 steps from the ramp when she saw him. Santos emerged from the jungle like a nightmare given form, his rifle raised, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that transcended hatred. Blood soaked his shoulder, and his face was a mask of grief and rage, but his aim was steady. He fired. The round took Elena in the side, punching through her ghillie suit and spinning her halfway around before she hit the ground. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and absolute, and for a moment the world reduced itself to that single sensation. She could not breathe. She could not think. She could only lie in the dirt and feel herself bleeding. The master sergeant's rifle answered Santos's shot, forcing the commander back into the jungle. Hands grabbed Elena's vest and dragged her toward the Osprey, her heels leaving furrows in the mud. She tried to help, tried to get her legs under her, but her body had stopped taking orders. "She is hit," someone was shouting. "Medic, she is hit." The ramp of the Osprey swallowed her, and then the aircraft was lifting off, the jungle falling away beneath them in a blur of green and brown. Elena stared at the ceiling of the cargo bay and listened to the voices around her, calm and professional, calling out vitals and wound assessments and things she should probably care about, but could not quite focus on. A face appeared above her. The master sergeant, his expression unreadable. "Stay with us, Phantom. You did not survive all that just to die on a ride home." Elena wanted to respond, wanted to say something clever or defiant, but the darkness at the edges of her vision was expanding, and she was so tired. She had been tired for 8 months, tired for years, tired since the day she had accepted a life that demanded everything and offered nothing in return but the knowledge that she had made a difference. She let the darkness take her. 6,000 miles away, on the USS Green Bay, Lieutenant Commander Preston Whitmore watched the extraction unfold on the drone feed and felt his world collapsing. The SEALs were alive. The rescue had succeeded. And somewhere in that chaos, someone had sent a burst transmission that had changed everything. He had seen the communication logs. The transmission had been brief, barely 20 seconds, but it had contained enough information to burn him completely. Asset identification, mission parameters, and his name. His name, transmitted in the clear, tagged as the source of the intelligence leak that had nearly gotten 6 Americans killed. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents arrived 12 minutes later. Whitmore saw them enter the Combat Information Center, saw the way they moved with purpose toward his station, saw the rest of the room pretending not to notice. He thought about running. He thought about lying. He thought about all the things he could say to explain away the evidence that was already being compiled against him. Instead, he just sat there and waited for them to reach him. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore, the lead agent, said, her voice carrying the flat effect of someone who had done this 100 times before. You need to come with us. He stood without resistance. There was no point in fighting. The moment the transmission had gone out, his fate had been sealed. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, everything he had told himself about being a good officer despite his mistakes, it was all ashes now. As they led him from the room, he passed a monitor showing the medical bay. The wounded SEALs were being treated, surrounded by doctors and corpsmen working with urgent efficiency. One of them, a petty officer with his arm in a sling, was talking to a chaplain with tears streaming down his face. Whitmore looked away. He could not afford to see them as people. If he saw them as people, he would have to acknowledge what he had done, and that acknowledgement would destroy whatever was left of his ability to function. The agents took him to a secure compartment deep in the ship's interior. They sat him in a chair and read him his rights and began asking questions he had no intention of answering. He requested a lawyer. They told him one would be provided. Then they left him alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his life, as he had known it, was over. He thought about how it had started. The gambling, first, a way to relieve stress, he had told himself. A harmless vice that plenty of officers indulged. Then the debts. Then the offer from a man who knew too much about his situation and offered a simple solution. Just information. Just schedules and patrol routes. Nothing that would get anyone killed. But information always got someone killed. He had known that, somewhere beneath his rationalizations. He had known, and he had done it anyway, because the alternative was admitting that he had lost control of his life. 12 Americans dead because he could not admit he had a problem. 12 families destroyed because he had been too proud to ask for help. Whitmore put his head in his hands and wept. On the Osprey, Elena drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked to stabilize her. The round had passed through her side, missing her vital organs by centimeters, but she had lost a significant amount of blood. They were pumping fluids into her, packing the wound, doing everything they could to keep her alive until they reached a surgical facility. She dreamed of her father. He was sitting beside her hospital bed, just as she had sat beside his in his final days, and he was speaking to her in the Ukrainian of her childhood. Words she had almost forgotten, phrases that carried the weight of memory and love. You did well, he said. You did what I could not. You chose people over orders. I broke my mission, she replied in the dream. I compromised everything. Her father smiled. That gentle smile she remembered from before the cancer had taken him. You save lives. That is never a compromise. That is always the mission. She woke to the sound of rotors changing pitch and the sensation of descent. The Osprey was landing, and through the open ramp she could see the flight deck of the USS Green Bay, medical teams waiting with stretchers and equipment. The master sergeant was beside her again. His hand found hers and squeezed with a pressure that conveyed more than words could express. Welcome back, he said. You gave us a scare. Elena tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She managed a nod instead, a small gesture that took more effort than it should have. The SEALs made it, the master sergeant continued. All of them. Kendricks is already asking about you. Wants to know the name of the angel who saved his life. Elena closed her eyes and felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the drugs they were pumping into her. She had broken every rule. She had compromised her mission and revealed her existence, and nearly died in a jungle that was supposed to be nothing more than an observation post. And she had saved them. All of them. The stretcher bearers lifted her from the Osprey and carried her across the flight deck toward the medical bay. Above her, the Philippine sky was clearing, the monsoon clouds giving way to patches of blue that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of the jungle. She was alive. They were alive. And somewhere on this ship, a traitor was finally facing justice. For the first time in 8 months, Elena allowed herself to believe that what she did mattered. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Elena was conscious for none of it, suspended in a pharmaceutical twilight while Navy surgeons repaired the damage that Santos's bullet had carved through her body. The round had nicked her liver and cracked 2 ribs before exiting through her back, leaving a wound channel that would have killed her in minutes without immediate intervention. She woke in the recovery bay to the sound of monitors beeping and the antiseptic smell of military medicine. Her body felt strange, disconnected, wrapped in bandages and floating on a tide of painkillers that made the world soft around the edges. She tried to move and immediately regretted it as fire lanced through her side. Easy. A corpseman appeared beside her bed, young and earnest, with the careful hands of someone who had treated too many combat wounds. You took a bad one. Doc says you're going to be fine, but you need to stay still for a while. Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to get up and find Achterberg and Kendricks and confirm with her own eyes that they had survived. But her body refused to cooperate, and after a moment, she surrendered to the reality of her situation. The SEALs, she managed. Her voice was a croak, barely recognizable as human speech. All stable, the corpseman said. 2 in surgery, but they're going to make it. The senior chief has been asking about you every hour. He is in the next bay over. I can let him know you are awake. Elena nodded, and even that small motion sent ripples of pain through her torso. Achterberg appeared 15 minutes later, his arm in a sling and butterfly bandages covering a gash on his forehead. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 24 hours, but his eyes were clear and sharp as they studied her. You look terrible, he said. You should see the other guy. Achterberg's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down with the careful movements of a man cataloging his own injuries. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, the kind of quiet that existed between people who had bled together. I need to know, he finally said. Who are you? Really? Elena considered the question. Her cover was already blown. The master sergeant had known her call sign, which meant someone in the command structure had authorized revealing her existence to the rescue team. The carefully constructed fiction of the past 2 years was already unraveling. I work for an organization that does not officially exist, she said. I was sent to observe your mission because intelligence suggested someone was leaking operational details to enemy networks. Your team was bait. If the ambush matched certain patterns, it would confirm who the traitor was. Achterberg absorbed this information with the stillness of a man who had learned not to react until he understood the full picture. You were going to watch us die. Those are my orders. But you did not follow them. No. Elena met his eyes. I did not. The senior chief nodded slowly. He did not ask why. He did not need to. Some questions answered themselves in the space between soldiers who had chosen conscience over duty. The traitor, Achterberg said. Did you find him? Lieutenant Commander Whitmore. Your intelligence officer. He is in custody now. Something dark passed across Achterberg's face. He had known Whitmore, worked with him, trusted him with the lives of his men. The betrayal was personal in a way that transcended professional obligation. I want to see him, Achterberg said quietly. That is probably not a good idea. I did not say it was a good idea. I said I want to see him. Elena understood. She had felt that same need after her father's death, the desperate desire to confront the cancer that had taken him as if rage could undo what had already been done. But cancer could not be confronted, and confronting Whitmore would not bring back the radio man who had died in the first seconds of the ambush. His name was Torres, Achterberg said, as if reading her thoughts. The radio man, Miguel Torres, 23 years old. He was going to propose to his girlfriend when we got back from this deployment. He showed me the ring 2 days ago. Elena closed her eyes. Another name to add to the list she carried. Another face she had not been able to save. "I am sorry," she said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Achterberg shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. You saved 5 lives today. You broke your orders and compromised your mission and nearly died because you decided that watching Americans get slaughtered was not something you could do." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Do not apologize for that. Ever." The door to the recovery bay opened, and Kendricks appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse who looked like she had given up trying to keep him in bed. His arm was immobilized, and his face was pale, but he was smiling with the pure joy of a man who had accepted death and then been handed his life back. "She is awake," he said to Achterberg. "I told you she would make it." He wheeled himself to Elena's bedside and reached out with his good hand to take hers. His grip was weak but warm, carrying gratitude that words could not express. "I called my wife," he said. "Told her I am coming home. Told her about the angel in the trees who made sure I would be there for Sophia's birthday. She wants to meet you. She wants to thank you herself." Elena felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had built to keep herself isolated and functional in a life that demanded isolation. Tears she had not shed in years prickled at the corners of her eyes. "I was just doing my job," she said. Kendricks shook his head. "No, your job was to watch. You chose to act. That is not duty. That is something else." Elena did not have a word for what it was. Conscience, maybe, or compassion, or simply the inability to watch good men die when she had the power to stop it. Whatever it was, it had cost her everything she had built over the past 2 years. Her cover was blown. Her mission was compromised. The organization she worked for would have to decide what to do with an asset who could no longer operate in the shadows. But looking at Kendricks's smile, thinking about Sophia and her mermaid dreams and a birthday party that would happen because Elena had made a choice, she could not bring herself to regret it. Some things were worth more than missions. Some things were worth more than careers. Some things were worth everything. 3 days after the extraction, Elena was transferred to a secure medical facility in Okinawa. The Navy doctors had done excellent work stabilizing her, but the organization she worked for had its own protocols for handling compromised assets. She was moved in the middle of the night, loaded onto a transport aircraft with blackout windows, and delivered to a hospital that did not appear on any official maps. Her handler arrived on the 4th day. Gerald Crane was 62 years old, a former CIA case officer who had transitioned into the Joint Task Force after 3 decades of running agents in places that made the Philippine jungle look like a vacation resort. He had recruited Elena personally, trained her himself, and spent the past 2 years guiding her through operations that would never be acknowledged by any government. He sat in the chair beside her bed and studied her with eyes that revealed nothing. "You broke protocol," he said. His voice carried no accusation, no anger, just a flat statement of fact that characterized everything he did. "Yes, you revealed your existence to foreign nationals and American military personnel outside the NITANO framework. Yes, you compromised an operation that took 14 months to develop and cost the agency $11 million to execute." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." Crane was silent for a long moment. Outside the window, the Okinawa sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Elena of fire, of muzzle flashes, of the blood that had soaked into the jungle floor. 6 Americans are alive because of what you did," Crane finally said. "The intelligence leak has been neutralized. Whitmore is cooperating with investigators, and his information is leading us to a network we did not know existed." He paused. The mission parameters called for observation only, but the mission objective was always to protect American lives and identify hostile intelligence operations. Elena waited. She knew Crane well enough to understand that he never said anything without purpose. "You achieved the objective," Crane continued, "through methods that violated every protocol we have established, through choices that exposed you and endangered the broader operation." He leaned forward slightly. "And you did it because watching Americans die was not something you were willing to do." "I cannot just observe," Elena said. "I know what the mission required. I know what I was supposed to do. But when I saw them pinned down, when I saw them dying, something changed. The mission stopped being about intelligence gathering. It became about people. Crane nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. That is why I recruited you. Not because you follow orders without question. Because you understand that orders exist to serve a purpose, and when the purpose and the orders diverge, you have the judgment to choose correctly. Elena felt confusion replacing the resignation she had been carrying since waking up in this facility. She had expected consequences, termination from the program, possibly criminal charges, certainly the end of her career in special operations. She had not expected this. "I am not being discharged," she said. It was half question, half realization. "No." Crane's expression softened by a fraction of a degree. "You're being reassigned. The Whitmore case has opened doors we did not know existed. His network extends far beyond the Philippines. We have identified potential compromises in 3 other operational theaters, possibly reaching into the Pentagon itself." Elena absorbed this information. The scope of what Crane was describing was enormous, a counterintelligence operation that could take years to complete. "You wanted to find them," she said. "I want you to lead the team that finds them." Crane reached into his jacket and produced a folder marked with classification stamps that Elena had rarely seen. "Your actions in the Philippines demonstrated capabilities we need. Not just tactical skills, but judgment. The ability to adapt when circumstances change. The willingness to make hard choices when the stakes demand it." He placed the folder on her bedside table. "This is your new assignment. Review it when you are ready. We will discuss details once you are cleared for duty." Elena looked at the folder, but did not reach for it. Something was still bothering her, a loose end that refused to resolve itself. "Santos," she said, "the enemy commander. He escaped." Crane's expression flickered, just for a moment, before returning to its usual mask. "Yes. Our intelligence suggests he survived the extraction operation and has gone aground. He lost most of his fighters and his brother in the engagement. He will rebuild, eventually. Men like him always do. He will come for me," Elena said. Not as a question. Possibly. Crane stood and adjusted his jacket. "But that is a problem for another day. For now, focus on recovery. The work will be waiting when you are ready." He left without further ceremony, leaving Elena alone with the folder and the sunset and the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. She thought about Santos, about the grief that drove him, the rage that sustained him, the purpose that his pain had created. She had seen the same things in herself, once. The same transformation of loss into mission. The difference was the direction that transformation had taken. Santos destroyed, Elena protected. 2 sides of the same wounded coin. She reached for the folder and opened it. The documents inside outlined an operation spanning 4 continents, targeting a network of intelligence brokers who had been selling American secrets for decades. Whitmore had been a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and the picture that puzzle formed was terrifying in its scope. Elena read for an hour, memorizing names and locations and patterns of tradecraft that painted a portrait of institutional betrayal. The people responsible were not monsters. They were officers and analysts and support staff who had made small compromises that grew into large ones, who had told themselves that information was harmless until the bodies started piling up. She thought about Torres, the radio man who would never propose to his girlfriend. She thought about the 12 Americans who had died before she arrived in the Philippines. She thought about all the deaths she did not know about, the operations compromised by intelligence sold for money or ideology or simple human weakness. The network had to be dismantled. The bleeding had to stop. Elena closed the folder and set it aside. Her body was still healing, still fragile, still weeks away from operational readiness. But her mind was already working, already planning, already mapping the connections that would lead her to the people responsible. She had saved 5 lives in the Philippine jungle. That was a start, but it was not enough. It would never be enough until the system that had endangered those lives was torn out by the roots. Elena closed her eyes and let herself rest. The work would be waiting. It always was. And this time, she would be ready. 2 weeks after the jungle, Elena stood in a conference room at Joint Base Pearl Harbor and watched 5 men receive awards they would never be able to display publicly. The ceremony was classified at a level that meant no photographs, no records, no acknowledgement that it had ever occurred. But the people in that room knew what had happened, and that was enough. Senior Chief Achterberg received a Bronze Star with Valor Device. Kendricks and the other survivors received Purple Hearts and commendations that would be sealed in files no one outside the intelligence community would ever see. The radio man, Torres, received a posthumous Silver Star that his family would be told was for actions in a training accident. The lies were necessary. Elena understood that. The truth would expose operations and methods that protected American lives every day. But watching Torres's medal being accepted by a representative who would deliver it to parents who would never know how their son really died, she felt the familiar weight of the shadows she lived in pressing down on her shoulders. After the ceremony, there was a reception in an adjoining room. Sandwiches and coffee and the awkward small talk of people who had shared something profound and were now expected to pretend it had never happened. Elena stood in a corner, watching the others interact, feeling like a ghost at a party for the living. Achterberg found her there. He had cleaned up well, his dress uniform crisp, and his wounds healing into scars that would fade with time. He carried 2 cups of coffee and offered her one without asking if she wanted it. "You do not do well at parties," he observed. "I do not do well at anything that requires pretending." Achterberg nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I spoke to Crane. He told me you were taking on a new assignment. Something big." Elena sipped her coffee and did not respond. The details of her new mission were classified, even from the people she had saved. "I'm not asking for details," Achterberg continued. "I know how this works. I just wanted to say something before you disappear into whatever shadow operation is claiming you next." He turned to face her directly, and Elena saw something in his eyes that she had not expected. Respect, certainly. Gratitude, obviously. But something else beneath those things, something that looked almost like concern. "What you did in that jungle," he said quietly, "it changed things. Not just for us, not just for the mission. It changed things for me. I have been in special operations for 20 years. I have seen courage and sacrifice and everything in between. But I have never seen anyone do what you did. Choose people over protocol. Risk everything for strangers." "I was doing my job," Elena said. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "No." Achterberg shook his head. "You were doing something else. Something I do not have a word for." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion he was clearly not accustomed to expressing. "I pray every morning. Have since I was a kid. After what happened out there, I started praying for you too. For whatever you are facing next. For whoever you're going to save." Elena did not know how to respond. Prayer was not something she had thought about in years, not since her grandmother's funeral when she was 16. But standing in this room, surrounded by men who were alive because she had made a choice that defied everything she had been trained to do, she found herself grateful that someone was praying for her. "Thank you," she said. The words were inadequate, but they were true. Achterberg nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of everything that did not need to be said. Then he straightened, and his expression shifted back to the professional mask that operators wore like armor. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, you know how to find me." He walked away before she could respond, rejoining his team with the easy camaraderie of men who had bled together. Elena watched him go and felt something warm settle in her chest, a connection she had not realized she was missing until it was offered. Kendricks approached her next, moving carefully with his arms still in a sling. He was smiling, that same joyful expression she had seen when he first arrived at her bedside on the ship. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his pocket with his good hand and produced a folded piece of paper. "Sophia made this. She wanted me to give it to you." Elena unfolded the paper and found herself looking at a crayon drawing. A woman with brown hair stood in a green tree, holding something that might have been a rifle or might have been a magic wand. Below her, stick figures in blue uniforms were surrounded by smaller figures in black. At the top of the page, In wobbly letters that had clearly been traced over an adult's pencil marks were the words, "Thank you, Angel." Elena's vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the tears that had no business forming in a decorated intelligence operative at a classified military ceremony. "She is 4, Kendricks said softly. "She does not understand what really happened. We told her that Daddy's friend helped keep him safe. She decided that friend must be an angel." Elena stared at the drawing, at the careful crayon strokes of a child who had no idea how close she had come to losing her father, at the simple gratitude expressed in primary colors and imperfect letters. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she said. Her voice cracked on the words, and she did not care. Kendricks put his good hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. "You gave me my daughter's birthday. You gave her every birthday she will ever have. A drawing is not nearly enough to thank you for that." "It is enough," Elena said. "It is more than enough." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the others mingle and talk and slowly begin to disperse. The ceremony was ending. The survivors would return to their lives, their families, their futures that had almost been erased in a Philippine jungle. And Elena would return to the shadows, to the work that demanded everything and acknowledged nothing. But this time, she would carry something with her. A drawing made by a 4-year-old girl who believed in angels. A prayer offered by a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still found faith. A connection to people who knew what she had done, even if the rest of the world never would. She folded the drawing carefully and tucked it in her jacket, close to her heart. Some things were worth more than missions. Some things were worth everything. Elena had finally found something worth believing in. 1 month after the Philippine jungle, Elena boarded a military transport at Andrews Air Force Base and began her journey toward a war that most Americans would never know was being fought. The investigation into Whitmore's network had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations, revealing connections that reached into the highest levels of the defense establishment. Names that appeared on television. Faces that briefed congressional committees. People who had sold their country's secrets while wrapping themselves in its flag. She had spent the weeks since her recovery preparing for this moment. Physical therapy to rebuild the strength the bullet had stolen. Intelligence briefings that painted a picture of institutional betrayal spanning decades. Operational planning that would take her to 3 continents over the next 18 months. The work would be difficult. The work would be dangerous. The work would demand everything she had and more. But for the first time in years, Elena did not feel alone. She reached into her jacket and touched the folded drawing that had not left her person since Kendricks had placed it in her hands. Sophia's angel, rendered in crayon, watching over stick-figure soldiers from her perch in a green tree. It was wrinkled now, softened by repeated handling, but the colors were still bright and the message was still clear. "Thank you, Angel." Elena had never thought of herself as an angel. Angels were creatures of light and goodness, beings that existed to serve a higher purpose. She was something darker, a weapon forged in shadows, designed to do terrible things in service of a country that would never acknowledge her existence. But perhaps that was what angels really were. Not creatures of light, but creatures of choice. Beings who saw suffering and decided to act, regardless of the cost to themselves. Beings who chose people over protocol, conscience over orders, love over duty. Perhaps everyone had the capacity to be an angel. Perhaps it was simply a matter of deciding what mattered most. The transport lifted off and banked toward the Pacific, carrying Elena toward the first target in a network that would take years to dismantle. Below her, the lights of Washington, D.C. faded into the darkness, replaced by the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. She thought about Achterberg back with his team, preparing for the next deployment. She thought about Kendricks, home with his daughter, watching her blow out candles on a birthday cake he had almost missed. She thought about Torres, buried in a cemetery in San Diego, his sacrifice known only to a handful of people who would carry his memory in silence. She thought about her father, the Soviet veteran who had taught her that some orders were worth breaking. She thought about her grandmother, who had pressed a small cross into her hands before fleeing Ukraine and whispered prayers over her in a language Elena had almost forgotten. She thought about Santos, somewhere in the Philippine Islands, nursing his wounds and his grief and his rage. He would rebuild. Men like him always did. And someday, their paths would cross again. Elena did not know when or where, but she knew it was inevitable. Some conflicts did not end until one side was destroyed. But that was a battle for another day. Today, she had a mission. Today, she had a purpose. Today, she had something she had not possessed in 8 months of isolation and silence. She had people worth fighting for. The transport leveled off at cruising altitude, and Elena allowed herself to close her eyes. Sleep had been difficult since the jungle, haunted by memories of gunfire and screaming and the faces of men she had killed. But tonight, exhaustion won over anxiety, and she felt herself drifting toward unconsciousness. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Sophia, the 4-year-old girl who wanted to be a mermaid. She imagined the birthday party she had made possible. Balloons and cake, and a little girl spinning in circles while her father watched with tears in his eyes. A moment of pure joy, purchased with blood and sacrifice and choices that had changed everything. That was what it meant to serve. Not the medals or the commendations or the classified files that recorded her achievements in language no one outside the intelligence community would ever read. Service was the birthday parties that happened because someone had been willing to die for strangers. Service was the children who grew up with fathers because someone had chosen people over protocol. Service was love, expressed through action, sustained through sacrifice, measured in lives saved rather than enemies destroyed. Elena slept, and for the first time in months, she did not dream of darkness. She dreamed of light. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell us about someone you know who answered the call when lives were on the line. Or share what moment hit you the hardest. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names we never learn. When Elena awoke, the transport was beginning its descent toward Okinawa, the first stop on a journey that would take her around the world. She looked out the window at the sunrise, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose. The knowledge that what she did mattered, that the sacrifices she made created ripples that extended far beyond her ability to see. Somewhere in San Diego, a little girl was waking up to another day with her father. Somewhere in Virginia, a team of SEALs was training for their next mission, alive because a stranger in a tree had decided that watching them die was not an option. Somewhere in the shadows, the work continued. Elena gathered her things and prepared to disembark. The hunt for Whitmore's network was just beginning, and the people responsible for selling American lives had no idea she was coming. They would learn. They would all learn. Because Elena Vashchenko had found something worth fighting for. And she would not stop until every last one of them faced justice for what they had done. The transport touched down, and Elena stepped into the light. Her war was just beginning.